Hi, welcome to another in my ongoing series of helpful tips for real estate buyers, sellers, and agents. My name is Stanley Bronstein. I've been a CPA for more than 25 years and an attorney for more than 20. I practice real estate and tax law in Scottsdale, Arizona. I'm licensed in both Arizona and Texas. Today's video talks about the pitfalls of real estate dual agency. With those details out of the way, let's jump right in. The 6 duties. Real estate agents owe 6 duties to their clients. Those are loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, reasonable care, obedience, and accounting. An agent's responsibilities under each of these 6 duties varies depending on whether they're a seller's agent, buyer's agent, or a dual agent. The 3 types of agents. There are seller's agents. These are people who represent the seller exclusively. There are buyer's agents. They represent the buyer exclusively, even though the commission they receive may be paid by the seller. And then there are dual agents. They represent both the seller and the buyer. They are sometimes referred to as representing the transaction. Duty number 1, loyalty. Seller's agents must do everything possible to benefit the seller. Buyer's agents must do everything possible to benefit the buyer. Dual agents may not do anything to gain advantage for either side over the other. If you're the client, if you're represented by a dual agent, they may not do anything for you to help you benefit over the other side of the transaction. So in other words, if you're represented by a dual agent, you don't get as much protection as you would if you were represented by your own agent. Duty number 2, disclosure. Seller's agents must reveal any known information to the buyer that materially and adversely affects the consideration being paid for the property. They must not reveal any other information to the buyer. A buyer's agent must tell the buyer everything they can find out about the seller and the property. A dual agent must reveal any known information to the buyer that materially and adversely affects the consideration being paid for the property, but they must not reveal any other information to the buyer or the seller which would be of benefit to them at the expense of the other party or would damage the other party. So in other words, if you're the client who's represented by a dual agent, once again, you're getting a lower level of service because they may not do anything for you to help you benefit over the other side of the transaction. Duty number 3, confidentiality. Seller's agents must tell the seller everything they can find out about the buyer, including financial details. They must conceal everything about the seller that would help the buyer gain an advantage. Buyer's agents must tell the buyer everything they can find out about the seller, including financial details. They must keep all information about the buyer confidential, including the buyer's ability to pay more than they are offering. Dual agents must keep all information about the seller and buyer confidential. They may not give either party advice or negotiation strategies. If you're the client who's being represented by a dual agent, yet again, you are receiving a lower level of service. That's because the dual agent may not do anything for you to help you benefit over the other side of the transaction. Duty number 4, reasonable care. Seller's agents must prepare through education and study to competently represent the seller in all matters. Buyer's agents must prepare through education and study to competently represent the buyer in all matters. Dual agents must prepare through education and study to competently represent both the seller and buyer, subject to the limitations of the law regarding dual agency. If you're the client who's represented by a dual agent, you must realize that your agent not only owes duties to you, but they owe those same duties to the other party in the transaction. Duty number 5, obedience. Seller's agents must obey all lawful instructions of the seller. They're not obligated to follow the instructions of the buyer. Buyer's agents must obey all lawful instructions of the buyer. They're not obligated to follow the instructions of the seller. Dual agents must obey all lawful instructions of both the seller and the buyer, as long as it will not benefit one side or the other. If you're a client who's being represented by a dual agent, you must realize that your agent does not have to obey your instructions if doing so will lead to your gaining an advantage over the other side of the transaction. Duty number 6, accounting. Seller's agents must account to the seller for any money or documents entrusted to them. They must report to the seller. Buyer's agents must account to the buyer for any money or documents entrusted to them. They must report to the buyer. Dual agents must account to seller and buyer for any money or documents entrusted to them. They must report to both seller and buyer, subject to limitations of the law regarding dual agency. If you're the client who's represented by a dual agent, you must realize that anything your agent is telling you is also being told to the other side of the transaction. In other words, don't tell your dual agent anything you don't want them to tell the other side of the transaction. Conclusions about dual agency. If you're the client who's being represented by a dual agent, you must realize that no matter what the agent tells you, you are getting a lower level of representation than you would if you were being represented solely by your own agent. Now, if you're a real estate agent who's representing someone as a dual agent, you must realize that you might get paid more, but you're opening yourself up to all kinds of increased responsibilities. While agents will disagree on this matter, I usually recommend that they do not act as dual agents on any transaction. I believe that if you act as a dual agent on a transaction, you are doing something that might be good for you, but could potentially be bad for your clients. In other words, if you're acting as a dual agent, you may be putting your own interests ahead of those of the client and opening yourself up to all kinds of problems in the future.